You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 76. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sara Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Today we want to explore the third aspect of integrity, practicing our values, not just professing them. As a reminder, the first two parts of integrity are choosing courage over comfort and choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy. And today, once we've explored our values, we'll tie together the definition of integrity.
So let me remind you that this episode is brought to you by Dare to Lead, a workshop based on the research of Brené Brown to help you learn the skills you need to be a brave leader and create a courageous culture. You can let us know you're interested by clicking on the button on the show notes page at transformingmission.org/076. So the question today is, are you practicing your values or professing your values? Back in episodes 62 and 63, we talked about actually identifying your values. So if you don't know what your values are, if you haven't come to the place that you've identified two things that you say that you value, jump back to episodes 62 and 63 and listen to those episodes and download the resources for that episode, because it's really hard to practice your values if you don't know what your values are. There's the statement of the obvious for today. What we mean by practicing your values and not just professing them is, I call this bumper sticker theology. You know, it's the slogans, it's the things that we literally see on bumper stickers, things like love wins. It's easy to say that. That's professing your values. It's harder to love. What does love look like? What are the actions? What are the behaviors that come around loving other people? That's practicing your values.
So professing your value may very well be true. Love wins.
Right.
But the integrity is living out the value.
Right. It doesn't do you much good to have that on the back of your car, and as you're driving down the road, what's happening in the car between you and the person sitting in the front seat is you're spewing hateful things about a coworker. That's not practicing your values. That is living outside of integrity.
That's meddling.
It's that too.
So it's harder to love than it is to practice. That works on other things too. Like it's easy to say that we value diversity.
Right. And on that one, is there anyone who, and I would say the same thing about love, is there anyone who wouldn't say, yes, I value love? Now, it might not be one of your core two values that you came down to, but we value that. There are things that we say that we profess, but how are we doing living into that? And that's where the integrity comes in to play. Because it's a heck of a lot harder to live into our diverse thoughts, expressions, communication styles, abilities, cultural backgrounds, life experiences, knowledge, understanding, and even faith. When you think about all of the behaviors around that and what that involves, it takes more time. It gets more complicated. We screw it up by making assumptions. Sometimes we feel bad, and then we try again. That's living into our values. That's practicing integrity. So you want to try another one? You've got one?
Well, let's try another one. Let me say this about diversity. And that is one of the things I have to be careful about is that I have real difficulty with people who have difficulty with diversity. And so if we call it, let's just say the people who are prejudiced, I can sometimes be more prejudiced against the people who I think are prejudiced.
Yeah, so how do you
live into the value of diversity in a holistic kind of way, not just with those who might agree with you, or this integrity piece is bigger than your tribe or people in agreement.
Right. And truly, just to give a personal example, I think for me, that's why when I was doing the exercise around what are my two core values, I think that's why I ended up with love being one of them. If I am going to live into my integrity, I have to stop and ask myself, how can I love people that I disagree with? How can I still be kind? How can I be curious? How can I engage with them? And at the same time, how can I lovingly communicate that we're not of the same mind? So it's not about condoning them and condoning something that is different, but accepting that we might be in different places, and that's okay. But to create that space where it's not just talking about it for the sake of talking about it, but seeking to understand so that I have a greater understanding of how did you get there? And they have a greater understanding about why that's such an important value for me. That there has to be something that propels us forward to ask the question that you've asked of, when we say that we value diversity, or when we say that we love people, you don't get to choose who that applies to.
Yeah, you've already chosen.
You've made a choice. So now what you need to get clear on is, how are you going to live into that?
How are you going to live into it? Right.
And that's where I would go back to the first part of the integrity definition. It's choosing courage over comfort. It's stepping into those difficult conversations and doing it with as much grace and humility as you can. It's calling people out on, you know what, that's not what I was saying, or that's not what my experience has been, or even on, help me understand. You say that you value diversity, but you won't sit down and even have a conversation with someone who thinks differently than you do about whatever.
Let me take that one step farther, because that's all very good. I like that. So if we are loving one another then, and we find ourselves in disagreement, one of the values is, how do we love in the midst of the disagreement? That's what you're saying.
Right.
And when we started talking about integrity, and we've talked about kingdom leadership and institutional leadership and the differences, here's where part of that integrity is even needed, is that as followers of Jesus, or people of faith, love is not limited just to where it's easy or fun. It's not limited to the people who agree with us. And we have to find ways to live into that loving people even when it's difficult. So when we go back to, say, choosing courage over comfort, actually the courage is living into the value.
Right. I mean, remember the second part of the integrity definition, which was choosing what's right over what's fun, fast, and easy. So I think the easiest illustration on this one is with parents. The most loving thing that you can do for a child is teach them to not run out into the middle of the street and get hit by a car. So you tell them no. That is a loving action. It limits them. It even tells them, no, that's not the way that it's going to be. And here's why. And I think maybe that's the part that we miss of, no, you're not going to run out in the street. Because if you run out in the street, you could get hit by a car or a truck, And then you're going to become Flat Susie on the pavement, and I want to love and nurture you to your next birthday. It's a silly example, but I think sometimes, especially when we talk about love, we think that means that anything goes, and that there aren't ways that we can lovingly place boundaries on what is happening.
So we got into that little conversation because you said, is there another one, Tim? And I'd say it may very well be that another place for value is it's easy to say that we want community. It's easy for us to say that we want community. It's much more difficult to live into community.
What is community?
That's what we have to answer first.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you have to define what does it mean to value community? Does it mean that because you value community, you're going to have a meal at your home once every week that you invite people to come and join you? Does it mean that you're actively serving in your neighborhood, in your local area, responding to a need in that area? Does it mean that you know the names of the people who live directly next to you or above you or beside you? What does community mean? Does it mean that you actively participate in civic engagement? Does it mean that you're a part of a Bible study at the church? I mean, I could go a million different directions with when someone says they value community, but how are you going to practice that?
How are you going to develop relationships? How are you going to live out this love or this diversity with a group of people around you?
Another one that I hear is, well, we value innovation and new things. And this one kind of makes me laugh because especially in the church, I don't find that we are good at what I'll call iterating or doing a beta version of something and knowing that this is just the first version and the next version is going to come. And that's where innovation happens. When we put something out in the world and go, that might not have worked quite the way that it needed to work. Let's go to my example from community. We said that we were going to have meals once a week in a few homes in the community, and it hasn't worked. And our tendency is that because we say it hasn't worked, we don't dig into why is it not working. It could be, and forgive me if this sounds simple, but it could be it's not working because people aren't inviting other people to come, because they don't even know the names and have contact information to say to folks, come join us. So you need to take a step back and say, okay, so how can we do that work to get to know the people that are around us and to offer the invitation so that can happen? What we tend to do is we just shut down the meal altogether and we don't do it. It didn't work. That's what happens. It's either there's success or there's failure, and it's based on number. It's not based on impact. So if you value innovation, how are you going to iterate, commit to creating different versions of it and commit to something for the long haul? I don't think that, the principles of disciple making will remain the same. How that ends up getting lived out and how it gets lived out in different communities is always going to be changing.
So with what you're saying, this is what I think of. When I was in Peoria, we had a missional gathering where people made a commitment. There were 3 women who made a commitment to go at that time to go to Louisiana to be a part of a work team after Hurricane Katrina. They did not plan to go, but because of that experience in the church, they went. And the experience they had with going, they came back. And the next year, over Christmas vacation, they took 30 people from that church to go back to work in the community where they had been. What led up to that was, well, we really don't know what to do. We don't know how to do it. If we knew how to do it, we wouldn't have the money to do it. That was the conversation. These three made a commitment, went by themselves, came back and said, now let's try this.
Right.
And after they tried it, the next time they come back and said, there are folks there who need furniture. Can we rent a truck and ask people to bring furniture? And I'm saying, how in the world can you do this when you're leaving on Thursday? The truck shows up on Tuesday. They fill it up on Wednesday and drive it down on Thursday. Now, when I think of what iteration and all of that, we started out by saying, what can we do? And then we're going with, we got more stuff than we can handle, so we'll get the second truck that will come down next week, and somebody who had not planned to go now is going to go for another week to take more. That doesn't mean it happens that way all the time, but once you step into it and you begin to see there are things that happen that say, we would never have expected this unless we'd gotten involved with it.
What I'm hearing you give an example of, Tim, is here are three women who are a part of a local congregation that, whether this was explicitly stated at that church or not, valued missional engagement. And so they were living into practicing their values. And they were taking those steps because it was something that they valued. It may not have worked. They might not have been able to get a truck. And they would have said, okay, the next time we go down, we'll take the furniture. We've got something to come back to. But that was driving the value that I see driving what they did. So you gave an example of how it was being practiced. The value that I see driving all of that, they may articulate it differently if we ask them, but they valued missional engagement. And they valued the needs of the people that they were going to serve. They didn't, another mistake that we make, they didn't say, well, we want to take bedding down, without asking the people who they were taking the bedding down if they actually needed bedding.
Right.
And so that, I guess I say that to say there can be a danger with values that we make assumptions or we place our values on someone else without asking the question. And so you've got to ask the question.
So that's one place that we live into our value. We're going through some things now in the country that we live in around the border with children, and immigration, and I'm moved deeply about that, and I'm trying to figure out how do I respond to that. And I read a lot of things, and I need you to help me here. Because I read a lot of things, and I think when we post something on social media or we give our opinion about something, we feel like we've done something about it.
That falls closer to professing our values than practicing them. That the posting on social media, whatnot. So, the action might be, is it that you need to communicate with your senators? Is it that you need to take a step back and ask the question, how is it as the district superintendent in a region in Ohio, that I help our churches think about this, knowing that people think very differently about this issue. Those might be ways of practicing your values. Maybe here's another question for you, Tim, because I remember when we did episode 62 and 63, I know one of your values was grace. I think the other one was consistency.
Correct.
So, thinking of those two values, what are the behaviors or actions that you need to take because of those values? What does grace look like when it comes to the humanitarian crisis with children at the border?
That's a good question.
What does consistency look like when?
So what I've tried to do, and working it through myself, because I have to confess it's pretty difficult when I see the images and I want to write something. I want to invite people in to give them a link that they can write a letter or make a phone call. And it goes, all that stuff comes rushing into me in a different way. I start thinking about other things in the past. I tried to put it in a biblical context. I try to talk about it in a way that's going to convince people that it's important. For me to live into the value of grace in the midst of that is that, I cut a lot of people a lot of slack, but at the same time, I'm saying, folks, there's something we must do, and it's not we don't say, oh, I feel bad, and then go on and do something else. We've got to do something to change that. Now, what that is, I haven't figured that out. The consistency part is I live with it every day. I don't put it away, and I don't try to deny it. I continue to try to address it in some way or another.
The example that was coming to mind around consistency, and it's not that it's still not happening, it was just there was a time that there were a series of shootings that happened in our country, in public squares, in schools, in social gathering places. And I remember, and you can still find these resources on the transformamission.org website, I remember you sticking with that long after everybody else had moved on to something else. And that's what we tend to do. And especially with these big challenging things that are happening in our world, that we feel like, well, what's my little rock going to do in terms of creating a ripple? And we forget that little rock creates a ripple that moves another ripple, that moves another ripple, moves another ripple. What I would say to you is sometimes we have to allow ourselves to receive the value as much as we need to give it. And so maybe practicing the value for you is giving yourself the grace to take the time to be thoughtful and prayerful about how can you respond.
Thanks for the gift. I'll receive it with grace.
No, I'm just being silly. I'll do that consistently.
You do. So there are other places that we, as we talk about living into values, professing as well as living into them.
So we've given you a few examples of how to practice values. That's going to be different for each one of us, because as you name your values, you're going to have to think through that. And Tim's just given you one that demonstrates and illustrates that sometimes as we're living into practicing our values, it's hard and there's not an easy answer. And so you take it one step at a time. So for the rest of this episode, we want to bring together episode 74, 75, and this episode, the 3 different aspects of integrity, and remind you that integrity is choosing courage over comfort, doing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy, and practicing our values, not just professing them. Notice I didn't say or. Integrity comes when you're holding all 3 of those things together. We broke them apart for the ease of your ease of listening to these episodes. Our question is, how are you doing with living into your integrity? Because it's a choice. And remember, if you choose courage over comfort, that's a choice. It's also a choice if you choose what is comfortable. It's a choice if you choose what is fun, fast, or easy. And every choice that we make has consequences. We all know that. What we're asking you to do is to be thoughtful and prayerful about the choices that you're making.
So just as there are consequences with choosing what's comfortable or fun, fast, easy, or professing your values, there are also consequences with choosing courage to do what's right and to practice your values.
As I've thought about it and reflected on it and messed this up and said to myself, okay, that wasn't so bad. And yes, I did it. What I've come to realize is that I can live with the consequences of courage, of doing the right thing, of practicing my values. And I think what I love is that choosing and practicing means that there are times that I know I'm not going to get it right. There's also something empowering about knowing that I get to choose. And to stop and think about, will it be courage or comfort? And I'll be honest with you, there are some days that I want to choose comfort. Why? Because it's easy. But then when I get to my values, and if I say integrity is a value of mine, and I do, how am I practicing that if I don't choose courage? So when I say I've come to realize that I can live with the consequences of courage, of doing the right thing, of practicing my values, part of that realization has been that when I choose what's comfortable, I either forget about something that was important or I regret not stepping into courage. And the same thing happens when I choose what's fun, fast, or easy over doing what's right. And when I choose to just talk about my values versus professing them, or versus practicing them, excuse me. This is something that we're stepping into. And let me remind you again that these are skills that you can learn. And we're learning them right alongside you because they're not things that most of us have been taught. And so our hope for the past 3 episodes is that we have given you some handles to hold on to think about, how are you living into your integrity? The question is, what choice will you make?
Sarah, one of the things that I want to say about what you've just said is that we want to come alongside the folks who are listening to help them live into their integrity. And when I say that, it's not about holding them accountable, it's holding them close, where they have someone who can just ask the questions that are needed to be asked, or to walk alongside in the midst of when comfort is being chosen over courage, and just be able to say, it's okay, let's get up and let's keep going. And when you say, what choice will you make? I think part of the value we have, even with the podcast, is that we've made a choice to be with the people who are listening, to help them, to help us all be who God created us to be, so that we can actually see God's work in our midst in and through the love we know in Jesus Christ. So I'm grateful for your leadership and how we've gotten to this point of just being able to make the choice of being with people in ministry.
And just to point you back to what Tim just said, an example from this episode, when Tim and I were having that conversation about what does he need to do to live into his values of grace, those are the relationships that we're talking about. Those are the conversations that we're talking about, that we want to be able to offer you someone else who can ask you those questions. Because the reality is we have a hard time asking them of ourselves. And I'm sure at some point, because Tim and I either see one another on a daily basis or we have a text going back and forth because of the work that we do, I'm sure at some point in the next week or two, I'll say to him, so did you decide anything? Have any more clarity? Notice I'm not saying, so what'd you do? That's not going to help him live into his integrity. It's not going to help him live into his values. So our invitation is really into relationship. So if you're wanting to learn more about leading with courage, if you're wanting to step into this work that we've been talking about, we reminded you at the beginning of the episode, I'll remind you again, that this episode is brought to you by Dare to Lead, a workshop based on the research of Brené Brown to help you learn the skills that you need to be a brave leader and to create courageous cultures. You can let us know that you're interested by clicking on the button on the show notes page at transformingmission.org/076. You can also sign up to be a LeaderCast Insider or subscribe to LeaderCast, brought to you by Transforming Mission on your favorite podcast player.
We want to remind you that Transforming Mission exists to help you transform your relationships with Christ, the congregation, and the local community. We've made the choice to come alongside you in living with integrity.
So now it's your turn. Will you go lead a movement of Jesus followers? We hope so. Bye for now.